Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask my questions in this order: Chang, Solomon, Ware, and Huff, if I get to all of you. Mr. Chang, thank you for your testimony about the needs to vulnerable communities to protect themselves. Can you think of any instance where Asian Americans have needed to use firearms to protect themselves?
Absolutely. We don't have to look any farther back than the 1992 LA riots. And in Koreatown, when LA was burning and Koreatown was under attack, and they called the LAPD for help. And the LAPD was under-resourced and unavailable to come to the aid of Korean Americans in Koreatown. So what did they do? Korean Americans utilized their Second Amendment rights and took their own personal firearms and protected their businesses, their lives, and their community.
When police departments are defunded, it is often communities of color that are most impacted. So, Mr. Chang, how does this impact the need for self-defense with firearms?
If we look back at the past year and a half or so with COVID-19, it's been a pressure cooker for all of us to see the civil unrest, the violence that has enraptured our country. And when you couple that with calls for defunding the police and taking law enforcement officers off the street, demoralizing them, dehumanizing them, it makes citizens like me feel less safe. And if I can't have law enforcement there to keep the peace in my community, then it is a rational conclusion that individual citizens like myself would opt to utilize my Second Amendment right to purchase a firearm and use that firearm in lawful and legal self-defense.
Okay. Ms. Solomon, you're a leader in the National African American Gun Association. So from your position, California is known to be a restrictive state in terms of gun control. Can you tell us about California's approach to gun control, which many are trying to reproduce on the federal level, and whether you think that approach is effective?
Here in California, there are a lot of measures that we do see being paired from the federal perspective. Some that can work, that works here, the private party transfer process where all gun sales do have to go through a dealer. That works well. But there's other things that essentially price people in my community out of being able to protect themselves. We don't have a blanket, a concealed carry weapons permit system here. Those who live in affluent areas like Orange County or Ventura County can protect themselves better than someone who lives in Los Angeles County, where Black and brown people mostly live. So unfortunately, the gun control measures that have happened here in California essentially affects people of my community more so than people of other communities where there are strained relationships with people in my community and law enforcement.
I'm going to have a second question for you if I have time. Otherwise, I'll submit in writing because I want to go to Ms. Ware. We've heard a little about the universal background checks, H.R. 8, and the extended background investigation bill, H.R. 1446. Would these bills be effective in reducing gun violence?
Senator, thank you for your question. So when we're talking about gun violence generally, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, there's a real balance between how HR in particular addresses a very small part of the problem in publicly advertised private sales and how it would detrimentally impact a larger part of the problem, which is gun suicides. Normally when people bring up background checks and private gun sales in particular, they're referencing impacts on mass public shootings. And I think it's important to recognize that with perhaps only one exception, these would not have played any meaningful role in preventing any mass public shooting in recent history. Perhaps, though I think it's questionable, the exception being the Odessa Midland shooting a couple years ago. The real problem is that most of these mass shooters actually pass background checks to begin with. That there isn't this sort of intermediate option for when they're exhibiting very serious signs of being unstable and violent toward themselves or others. So that's actually more so than background checks for prohibited persons. When we're talking about mass public shootings, the real issue is that many of these people, far too many, pass those background checks in the first place.
Okay, I've just got 5 seconds left, so let me ask Dr. Huff. Thank you for sharing your personal story with us. What measures do you believe would be best help others to avoid becoming victims of gun violence?
Well, quite honestly, I think, the old Boy Scout motto, always be prepared. I teach my sons when we walk into a restaurant, I used to have them close their eyes and would ask them, where are the exits? You need to be able to act fast. I think people should be able to protect themselves to the best of their ability. I think communities of color and communities that are of minority religious entities should be very wary of universal background checks for the same reason that I mentioned earlier. It does create a de facto gun registration. And then at any point in the future, and Lord knows history has shown us that bad things happen. We talked earlier about the folks of Japanese descent during World War II. We've certainly seen it with the Jewish communities and with African American communities. So I think those folks in particular should be very wary of universal background checks. Anytime we have a term like common sense gun laws, I think I think most of us find it kind of humorous because it's tagged common sense so that you don't want to vote against it, right? But it's anything but common sense, quite frankly. There are certainly things we can do. Again, in my written testimony, my husband talked about, my husband is a criminal psychologist, and he talks about threat assessments and how task forces can be formed that would have prevented a number of these things, like in Aurora and in Sutherland Springs, where people knew that these people were messed up before they ever got hold of a gun. They could have been prevented.